So the clock won't start until you start speaking. Yes, good. I think we're all blessed very much this morning by Tim's presentation, and I'm looking forward to this afternoon as well. We mentioned that he's in charge of Exponential Australia that he founded, and our church believes quite strongly in Exponential Australia, and Tim doesn't know this, but we voted at the division on Wednesday to give a donation of $20,000 to Exponential Australia. So, yes, can I just, yeah. I think I saw Pastor Glenn just walk in. I don't think he knows this as yet, but it's okay. It's not his money. Okay, come over and, oh, there he is. Sorry, Glenn. I asked Tim during lunch. The actual board of Exponential, I think, is quite interesting because it is made up of a wide variety of different denominations and movements. And last year at Exponential Gathering, how many different denominations?
There were 24 denominations.
Try it.
There were 24 denominations and another 5 networks represented. So it's 29 denominations or networks.
And it's sold out? For this year?
This one has sold out. It sold out in February for the August conference with 800 people.
Tell us a little bit about the composition of the board for Exponential Australia.
Okay, first of all, I'm going to apologise to the board. Wayne is chairperson of the board and just does an amazing job. So I'm very appreciative of Wayne there. We also have a guy who is now what's Peter's role?
Managing director.
No.
Business manager.
Basically the manager of Australian Christian Churches, the admin manager of that. We've got another ACC person on there. We've got a Baptist, Edie Stevenson, who with her husband run Building and Discipling Network and Crossway Baptists in Melbourne. The Salvation Army, we've got the lady who heads Salvation Army, church planting for the Salvation Army nationally. Michael Hands, who's from Uniting Church in Queensland. Myself, I lead a small Pentecostal denomination. Previously, we've had people from Churches of Christ, Acts Global Churches, who also used to be known as the Apostolic Church of Australia. And Darren is also from the ACC as well, and he heads a non-denominational ministry called the Jeffro Project. So we have a broad range of denominations represented.
And I just want to say, you can close your ears to this, I know few people who have the respect of denominational leaders and movement thinkers in Australia more so than Tim. So to have him involved in that is really something, and it's been a pleasure of me to be able to work with Tim the last few years. We did have someone step off the board because I was going on it.
Yes, we did. A person who was under the impression that she couldn't actually sit under a Seventh-day Adventist as chairperson. And so we said goodbye to her.
And we believe the Lord is blessing her. Can I just say we still have unfortunately, and it's changing a lot in the last few years, people believing the Seventh-day Adventist Church is a cult, and I'm not sure if I've helped or not helped in that space on Exponential, but it has been a joy of mine to be chair of that board.
Absolutely. Let me say that I reckon for every denomination in Australia, there'll be elements which are cultish within those denominations, and we just want to work with a good fruit across all denominations.
Let me pray again for Tim as we go forward. Lord, we do thank you. We do thank you that we can come together like this as brothers and sisters, joining you on your mission. And I pray again for Tim as he presents now. Give him again a double portion of your spirit, I pray in your name. Amen. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Wayne. Let me start by telling you about one of the great privileges of my life. In 2002, I went to a South Asian country, and I can't mention the name of the country here for security reasons. 15 of our pastors over there have been martyred. and the government is very aggressive as well as other militant groups. But you'll pick it up from the slides what I'm talking about in a moment. When I first went to this country, I saw a culture that was so different to Australia. I remember I went to a place out on the western border and it was very, very dusty. And I saw a man in these brightly coloured robes walking down the street with a walking stick. But the head of his walking stick was a battle axe. And then I saw another person, brightly coloured, walking past, and he had a scimitar sword around his hanging from his waist. And then you'd see a family of 5 going past on a motorbike. Yes, on one motorbike. And then in the capital city, I was quite amazed at times. I saw camels going along, towing trailers behind them. And really, this just looks so much like first century Christianity. At the time, there were about 150 churches in this church planting movement. And the founder of the church planting movement had a ridiculous vision of seeing 100,000 churches being planted by the year 2030 across this region. And this region was known as the missionaries' graveyard. It was only about 0.14% Christian. So what do you reckon? Was this crazy? Was my friend just an idiot for having that vision that he actually had? Oh, before we go on, the QR code. Just take a pause for a moment, a bit like a commercial break on the television. I want you to use your phone, grab the QR code, because that'll take you through to the sign-up page for our newsletter. And believe you me, you want to be on the newsletter that we send out and details of any conferences and events and things like that. And we put a lot of good information, research, resources, etc. on. Okay. So this is just an interlude, so you can actually do this. Okay, anyone need more time? No, that's cool. So back to the story. We soon saw that, practically speaking, there were 2 issues that we actually had to do, or 3, sorry, if we wanted to partner with God in this audacious vision of 100,000 churches being planted. You'll see on the screen there some of the students graduating from the training centres, and you'll also see pictures just depicting a little bit more about that particular culture. And I realised that the churches needed to be equipped to make disciples who would become workers for the harvest, because the harvest there was absolutely massive and the workers were really, really few. And the second thing that I realised was that the church planting movement needed to put in place intentional training mechanisms, intentional pathways, training centres to raise church planters. The vision was to actually have 100 church planter training centres in place. Back in 2003, I remember with the old Excel spreadsheet working out a lot of if this happens, then this happens, and we realised that we needed 100 training centres. Well, this last year we've got to 100 training centres, which is incredible. Have we got to the 100,000 churches? No, I'm afraid not. But we've got 50,000. And we're on track to get to the 100,000 just with the multiplication that's actually built into what actually happens. It's just been such an incredible work of God. And God calls us to partner with him in what he's doing today, not in terms of what he is doing yesterday. And by the way, we don't have any Caucasians working in this country. People like myself will go there frequently and provide assistance in the areas that we could and then go back out again, because we weren't of the culture, we didn't belong there. It had to be an Indigenous thing. Now, after I came back to Australia for the first time, I just thought, I've seen something like a book of Acts today. Why can't this happen here in Australia? And that's been what stirred me to this day, because I believe that we actually can see something like this, but not if we keep on doing church the way that we've done it in years gone by, because our people are different, the culture's different, the world's different, but too often the church remains the same. And you probably guessed from what I've said, there's a mismatch there in what I've said. So I realised in coming back to Australia that there were 3 things that we needed. The church in Australia needed to become better geared to making disciples, not just making comfortable Christians. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah? The second thing, we need to have mechanisms in place for raising planters, because the more planters we have raised, the more churches will be planted. Now, I've come to realise that having a wish and a desire and a prayer to raise planters isn't enough. Yes, we should pray for more planters. You know, I'll take you back to Luke 10 again. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. We're to talk to the Lord of the harvest about this problem. And he's going to be one who wants to move to solve the problem. But as he moves, we also must move. We must prepare ourselves. We must prepare the pathways and the pipelines in place, have them put in place for raising up men and the women to go into the harvest in ways that aren't necessarily like the pathways that have been there in the past. Now, to add a little bit more to this, at the end of 2024, I did a survey, a denominational survey, and it covered nearly 2/3 of the Protestant churches in Australia. So I think it was fairly representative. And one of the questions I asked was, what's stopping you planting more churches? And the answer, the strongest answer, it was over 90% that came through, we don't have enough church planters. And then I asked another question, what would help you plant more churches? Give us more church planters. And from the results of the survey, it became absolutely apparent that denominations across our country are being starved of church planters because, well, it's a bit like a farmer who looks at the fields and doesn't see the crops coming up and then realises he hasn't tilled the soil and planted the crops. If we want to see crops coming up which are church planters, we actually need to do something intentional about planting church planters, putting in place leadership pipelines. And I believe it needs to go even further. It needs to go back to our churches about how we actually make disciples. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times in my last session about I'm reading Peyton Jones's book, Discipology. Remember me saying that? One of you remembers me saying that. Yeah, I think so. Well, I want to see if this is going to work. So guess what? In my church, the church I'm part of, I've started a new small group. And we're actually going through the process there because I want to have the conviction of knowing that it's actually going to work. And not just telling people about the book, but telling people what actually happens as I actually go through and work with a bunch of men and women who we can actually disciple, hopefully, into the harvest. I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to be prepared to take risks and actually put our money where our mouth is, where we actually go and actually have a go of a thing so we can say, come follow me, come do what I've done, rather than this is a good idea, why don't you go and have a try? It's time to get our hands dirty. So the third realisation that I had was that what worked in the Asian country wouldn't work the same way in our country. We needed to learn how to apply the principles whilst adapting the methods. Now, the same truth applies in respect of a changing culture in Australia. The culture of Australia today isn't the same as it was 20 or so years ago. What worked in the past probably won't work in the same way now, will it? So to do this, and I want you to remember what I'm about to say, to do this, we must love the mission more than we love the method. You got that? We must love the mission more than we love the method. Another version of that is that we must love the problem more than we love the solution. So the problem is, how do we get into the harvest? And if we're fixed on that, rather than on the solutions that we've come up with, we will keep on trying solution after solution. But if we end up loving the solution instead, which is the method, we'll end up fixing our eyes on the method. And what works today mightn't work tomorrow. And this means that we must be open to adapt to new methods. You see, Jesus has given us this mission. I know you all know this, so I feel a bit silly reading it to you again, but I will, because I read it every time. Then Jesus said to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations. I'd say that's it. All people everywhere. baptizing in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. Over lunch, we're having a discussion about the difference between church planting in developing countries and in countries like Australia. And I said that in Australia, we often miss out of the Great Commission the bit about teaching them to obey, and we shorten it to teaching them. And as a result, we have knowledge-based discipleship rather than obedience-based disciple making. Can you imagine how different our churches would be if we actually literally took Jesus at his word and actually put into practice what he was actually teaching us? Going back to this, the Great Commission here, Jesus authorizes us. He commissions us. He instructs us. And he promises to accompany us. So why don't we go and do it? Now, there are probably many of you in this room who are doing it in an amazing way. So this is as much as a challenge to me as to anyone else. But you see, we need to love the mission. Loving the mission requires that we begin with the end in mind, and this will guide us. Loving the method means that requires that we keep the past in mind, and this will constrain us. Some of you may have heard of Ted Bolsinger, who was at Fuller Seminary. He wrote a book, Canoeing the Mountains, describing the need to practice adaptive leadership. He describes how in 1804, the Lewis and Clark expedition headed off from the east coast of America. They believed that there must be a way by way of water through the rivers to get to the west coast of America. And so they had these people who are experts in boats and canoes and rafts and that type of thing, highly, highly skilled individuals. And they went along travelling the rivers, and they ended up going up the mighty Missouri River. 8,000 kilometres later, they got to its source. And I could imagine scratching their heads thinking, where to now? So they went up the hill behind the source of the river and looked out and saw the Rocky Mountains in between them and their destination. You can't begin to imagine how discouraged they must have felt at that particular time. But to get to that point, to get to where they were, they used various kinds of boats, but the boats were incapable of taking them the whole way to accomplish the mission of reaching the Pacific Ocean. And so they had to adopt different methods that saw them move through the Rocky Mountains. Now, there's a lesson here for us. They were used to using boats in a particular way, but when they came to the mountains, they realised that the boats that had taken them so far could not take them where they needed to go. Likewise, friends, the form of church that was successful in the past won't necessarily be the form of church that carries us forward to where we need to go. We need to practice adaptive methods. And the way that we made disciples and raised leaders in the past may not work for Generation Z and millennials. The expedition leaders practiced technical leadership using the boat skills that they'd developed over the years, but technical leadership would only get them so far. They had to adapt and to use new skills that the situation actually required. Friends, this is a kairos time. This is a now time in our churches for doing likewise. The ways of the past we can learn from, we can build upon, but we can't stay there. Again, over lunch, some of us are talking about the church growth period and the principles that came out of there. We're no longer in using those models. That was a bygone time. But I love how I've heard a friend of mine in America, talk about this. He says, we are standing on the shoulders of the church growth age. In other words, there were benefits that came out of this age. There was so much that came out. But we can't park there. We can't stay there because the mission dictates that we keep on moving forward and develop adaptive methods that will actually take us forward. Now, one of the strengths of your movement, and I've mentioned this before, is that you don't require your church planters to plant according to a particular model. So you're not straitjacketing them into a particular model. Now, some denominations around Australia do have particular models, and some of them are serving them very, very well. So I'm not knocking having particular models, but particular models will tend to lock you into a particular way that, unless people are pretty savvy about the changes that are actually happening, can make them redundant in the future. Whereas, as I understand, with the Adventists, you're more about raising up the people who will plant churches in the way that God's actually asking you to plant the churches. And that, to be honest, that's always been my philosophy as well. What's God saying to you? In what context? How? Where? Why? That kind of thing. And, you know, again, earlier I used the analogy of what shape does water have? And the analogy was that it takes the shape of whatever contains it. And I think the way you plant churches, you have the ability to take the shape of the context where you are. So the lesson here is that your church planters must be prepared to adapt and innovate rather than follow the methods of the past. Now, I'm not here talking about Adventists specifically, or could be talking about any denominations. Men and women across our country are put off the thought of church planting because they look at what church is by looking at the church of the past. That's not where your vision needs to be. Your vision needs to be in terms of the mission, not the methods that have taken you so far. And then spending time in prayer, lots of time in prayer, just seeking out what the Lord is actually saying, how he wants to take you forward, so that you can actually work out how to actually make disciples and form church which will reach the communities in our cities. Again, going back to the book, Discipology, I guess, well, my hope out of this is that we can actually start new communities out of it, which may be part of a current church or may be separate. I don't really care. I want to see the kingdom of God spreading across our city and the cities. To me, that's the point, rather than growing a church. So you've got to know, though, and I'm sure you realise this, we live in times of rapid and significant change. Now, has anyone here heard the term VUCA? Well, the term VUCA is a sociological term, and it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. They're the times that we live in, aren't they? Where times are changing so quickly. Well, at least that's what I thought, though. I thought that was the time we're in. But then 2 years ago, I was with a friend from Europe who used to be one of the top international strategic planners for IKEA. And he in a presentation said, we no longer live in VUCA times. I thought, what? You got to be kidding. And he said, no, we've moved on to times that are never normal. And they were describing our times as never normal. Now, just to think about some of the changes over the last 20 years or so. Did you know it was only in the 2000s that Wi-Fi became widespread? Not long ago, was it? I couldn't live without my Wi-Fi these days. And even getting more serious, the iPhone and smartphones emerged around 2007. Digital banking became the norm in this period of time. Facebook was launched in 2004. Did you know that 87% of adults in Australia are on social media, spending on average about 19 and a half hours a week on different kinds of social media? Hey, how long does the average Australian spend in church? I think it's less than that, isn't it? So guess what's discipling us more? We keep going. Online church didn't exist until a few years ago, really. But now hundreds of thousands of Australians engage with church content online weekly through live streams, YouTube, podcasts, social clips, and digital discipleship content. And guess what? AI is creating a new future as we speak. Hey, look, I'm a baby to AI, but that VUCA image I actually did with AI. I put it in building blocks on an angle and kabam. And in my pocket, I've got my phone, which is actually recording me a transcript and also notes and summaries of what I'm saying on AI. I've got to tell you, the world is changing. But what doesn't change much in times like this? The church. The church. It makes it really hard to adapt, doesn't it? And now, I'm not suggesting that the church can actually adapt that quickly. But we are in a time of what's called discontinuous change. Has anyone heard of that term? Discontinuous versus continuous. Continuous change is incremental, ongoing change, right? Like I'm getting older day by day. That's continuous change, even though I might be in denial about that. Discontinuous change is when the world changes suddenly and radically, changing the environment in different ways. I'll give you some examples. When the printing press was first developed, was it in the 1600s, I think it was? That radically changed the world because it changed our ability to, the ability of people to read, or the desire, capacity to read, and hence education, commerce, everything changed. Another time of extreme change was the Industrial Revolution taking place. The Industrial Revolution saw huge numbers of people leave the country and go into the city where they can work in factories. So again, that had a massive change on culture. Another area of change, of discontinuous change, was in the 1970s when the contraceptive pill came about. That had a huge change in terms of our culture. The discontinuous change used to happen pretty well every 100 years, but now it's happening all the time. It is really happening all the time. Now, the thing is, I want you to remember this. In times of discontinuous change, the answer is not in doing things better. The answer is in doing things differently. Can you imagine, going back, say, 20, 30 years ago, you had a film distribution business and people would produce films and it was your role to distribute it. One of the things that you might have done was perhaps purchase the chain of video stores like Blockbuster Video. Does anyone remember VCRs? Yeah, yes, some of you do, some of you don't. Audience split. Yes, and so I think places like Blockbuster used to have the films on VCRs. Can you imagine if you were competing with other video stores in the town? The way you'd do it was by trying to be better than them, right? But then there was a change that happened. Instead of VCRs, DVDs became the norm. And so you had to adapt and do things differently to an extent if you wanted to compete. Even if you had the best VCR store in town, but everyone was buying DVDs or renting DVDs, you'd be out of business. But then what happened? Where do we see the DVD stores today? We don't, because online streaming, originally, things like Apple TV and Netflix and a whole bunch of other avenues came on board. But the thing is, the message in the film might be the same, but the way of actually taking it to market has changed and changed radically. That's an aspect of discontinuous change, where if you were competing in the old way, even if you were the best in town, it still wouldn't be good enough. You actually had to change. Now, I'll put it to you that the church is in one of these kairos times of change as well. Doesn't mean that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. It may well be that we recognise that some churches will never change, but we have to plant new churches. And the new churches that we plant can't look like the old churches. That market is gone, using commercial terminology. We actually have to prepare ourselves for the future. Now, I want to very quickly look at 4 different techniques or strategies that might help in dealing with change. And some of these might help address some of the questions that I was asked last time. I bet you've never heard of the thing called the barbell theory. Well, you're about to. You're blessed. Okay? So the barbell theory was developed, and it talks about the majority of people, say 85% of people, don't like risk. So they're the ones on the right-hand side. They have a high need for stability. Think of most people in your congregation. But then there are probably 15% of the people, roughly, who are up for new things, willing to give the new things a go. That's the left barbell. Now, the theory is that the leader's role is to stand in the middle and to keep the risk takers separate from the ones who want stability. The ones who want stability want working methods. The risk takers are prepared to find those working methods. So the leader's role is to keep the two separately. Can you imagine if you're in a risk-taking part and you came along and you wanted to try this and that and whatever? It'd be like throwing pearls to pigs, because the people who wanted stability would say, no, that's not going to work. No, I can see the flaws in that. It's not even godly. They'd have all of these reasons why not. Now, in America, there was a division of a company called Skunk Works. I bet you've never heard, or most of you have never, someone has heard of Skunk Works. So Lockheed Martin, the aerospace engineers, after World War II, they decided that they wanted to set up an innovation hub, which could be an answer for denominations, that you set up innovation hubs for church planters. But they realised they had to keep it separate from the factory. Now, Lockheed Martin have developed stealth fighters and a huge number of the technology that we see in wars today, but also in the commercial world today, because it was developed in the Skunk Works factory. Do you know why it was called Skunk Works? Because there's a smell in the factory they couldn't get rid of. And so they called the whole factory Skunk Works. And so Skunk Works was left to work through these innovations that everyone else thought crazy. And, you know, they were prepared for the fact that out of 10 innovations that they poured a lot of money into, 9 of them may fail. But the one that worked might change the world. And that's exactly what's happened. In a way, church needs to develop its own Skunk Works, doesn't it? Where we have our innovation hubs, that we take the risk takers who are prepared to go and do things different to the rest of the church. If I look at my own church, my wife Sharon and I, some years ago, we decided that we wanted to run our small groups differently. We didn't try and get the whole church to follow our crazy way of doing it. Has anyone heard of Discovery Bible Story? Okay, we've got 2 people. Do I have any raises on 2 people? Yes, quite a few people. That's good. And we decided that we wanted to run our small groups along the line of Discovery Bible Story, but just for ourselves. And so I remember there was a couple, Toby and Carmen, who were unchurched. And Toby was an atheist. And he didn't know even if the story about Jesus was a real story or just like a fairy tale. But we developed a friendship with this couple, both in the mid-30s. We invited them around to our place for dinner and said, look, we've got a few friends who are coming around and we're going to be doing going through a book, a bit like a book club kind of thing, doing a chapter for chapter. And the book that we'll be looking for is one of the biographies of Jesus. In other words, it was one of the Gospels. And so we did that. We'd read out the story. Then we'd ask, what did you like about the story? What did you see the people doing? What did you see Jesus doing? Is there an application to, is there a principle to apply to our life? That kind of thing. And we'd do that every week over dinner. In time, Toby and Carmen asked if they could get baptised, and they came to faith. Since then, there have been other people who've come to faith in our small groups. People who've been Christians quite a few years have also grown a lot in our small group. A year ago, we divided. We launched out and started another small group out of ours because we'd grown too big. And just this year, we've done that again. And we didn't have to tell the rest of the church this is what you have to do. They saw a working model and then they started copying it. And most of the small groups in our church are now just based around Discovery Bible Story. They don't have to be, but they are. And it's helped, I think, change some of the fabric in the church. So I think with the barbell theory, you know, one of the challenges is in your church, in the churches that you're part of, you may be able to find some risk takers who you can actually commission to go and do something different without expecting the whole church to follow. But when they get a working model up and running, potentially the rest of a church can actually look at catching on. Does that make sense? So that's one thought. Now, the next thing I want to mention to you, the graph on the side is called the diffusion of innovation. And so it's a bell curve there. And it will say that on the left-hand side, you've got 2.5% of any normal group of people that are innovators. Then you've got probably another 14 or 13.5% who are early adapters. So in any congregation, you'll probably find people who are up for change. And this talks a bit to the thing that the barbell that we've just been talking about. But then there are a lot of people in the middle, and then on the right-hand side, there are people who just don't want to change. But it's saying you go with the people who are actually open to change and see what you can pioneer. Now, there are three kinds of people that I want to mention. The first is according to the diffusion of innovation as the early adopters and the innovators. Find them in your congregation. They're up for a risk, they're up for a challenge, they're up for change, and see if you can actually work with them. The second is new believers. People who haven't had years and years and years of being trained in this is what church is and this is how we do church. Now, I came to faith at 26. I'm also an innovator or early adapter. And so I'm quite open to change. The third area is the young. You know, by the time we get to our mid-20s, our brains start, well, they call it becoming less fungible. In other words, we become more set in our ways, less open to the new. What about if we actually started with high school kids and actually got them to brainstorm about how do we actually make disciples, beginning with the end in mind, loving the mission more than the method, and working back, what would church actually look like? What would our youth group actually look like if instead of actually starting with where we are and trying to go out? So here's another principle. Most innovations fail because they adopt what's called factory or production innovation. They start where we are and work what we can actually work out how we can move it forward, rather than beginning with the end in mind and designing back to what we can actually do. During COVID, a classic of that was when churches couldn't meet, would see so many churches, all of a sudden they put what they were already doing online and just found a new way of taking the old to the audience. There were some churches, not many, but some actually took a different approach of actually looking at who they wanted to reach and then thinking, how can we use technology to reach these people? And then working backwards and designing a product that mightn't have looked like their normal weekend worship service at all. So if we try and find those people who are open to change, the innovators and the early adapters, the new believers and the young, we can potentially do innovation by design to actually work back and work out what church should look like. Again, I had the discussion earlier today about what are the minimum requirements of doing church. I did an article on that some months ago, which is under the resources section on the Exponential website, where it's a number of people's perspectives on what are the minimum requirements for church to look like. But we don't have to necessarily do what the church that we have come out of or grown up in has done. We can look to innovate. One other thought for you. Last October, I put out an e-booklet, so it's available free of charge. But it contains 10 tweaks that you can put in any church to bring about multiplication happening. Now, either email me or you can find it on the website under the resources section. But they're not huge changes. They're small changes, but if you actually make those changes, you'll end up with the operating system being changed over time. I know some denominations have got their senior leaders from their churches going through this book, one chapter at a time, once a month online, getting a group of 4 or 5 or 6 pastors together to discuss each of the changes and whether it's relevant for their church and how they contextualise it in their church. So sometimes we can bring about change slowly by making small changes that have a big impact. And again, the analogy here may well be flying from, say, Sydney to Melbourne. If you just make a difference of 1 or 2 degrees in terms of your flight path, the destination is quite different. So that's another thing we can do. The last thing that I want to mention is that we actually can start something new. When my wife and I planted our church all of those years ago, we wanted to take different approaches and we wanted to try different things. And we knew, and this won't be the case in all situations, but we knew that we couldn't do it in any of the local churches that were nearby. They'd be too concerned that we were going to really muck things up and do the wrong thing. And so we actually went out with a denomination support of actually starting something new. We're a risk for them, I guess. We're a bit of a skunk works to go and see. But, 32 years later, we're still here and the church is healthy. So I would have to say that it actually worked, and it worked probably beyond our different to what we originally imagined, but it did work. It has worked. If you're starting something new, again, generosity and grace are really important. Because if you're sending out someone new, you can't expect them to do what you've always done. Otherwise, you won't get a different result. You've got to expect that they will take risks. Sometimes it might be safer to turn a blind eye because you might approve of the way they're going about things. I'm not talking about character or morality issues here. I'm talking about techniques. I mentioned to you earlier about the church in South Australia that was planted in 2014 and has seen 300 baptisms and planted 7 churches, and 3 of those churches are planted. And I mentioned to you about how at times they've given away 40% of their congregation, including their best givers, their best elders, their best musicians, that kind of thing. That's the kind of generosity that I think we need to have if we're prepared to send people out to start something new. Years ago, my wife and I in 1999, we were in the office of a gentleman called Gilbert Bilzekian at Willow Creek Community Church in Chicago. And he told us then that a scripture that he believes is right at the core of multiplying ministry is Genesis 2:24. And Genesis 2:24 says that this is why a man leaves his father and his mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. And shouldn't that be the case for churches? Well, what do we call a family that keeps its kids home to the day they die? Dysfunctional? Toxic, dysfunctional, controlling? No, I look at my oldest, you what, sorry? Yeah, okay. I won't say anything there, thank you. I look at my oldest son, Jonathan, and I remember when he was in his mid-teens, he had a bunch of friends who come around to play footy or cricket. And I used to love playing footy or cricket with them. I used to have a good time with them. But you know what? It wasn't because of me that they come around. I took that very, very bravely when I realised that. They came around because of my son. And his culture came from my wife and myself. His DNA came from my wife and myself, but it was unique. And it was what was necessary to mix with people of his age. And isn't it the same with the church? Our churches will get a culture and a DNA that suit a certain style of people. But for my son, I've got 3 children, my others as well, they've had to get to the point where they've had to leave home and find a husband or a wife and then start having their own children. And you know what? our community, our family community has multiplied in the most beautiful way. And I can't wait to meet my grandson who was born yesterday when I was in transit. Yeah. So each of my 3 kids has now got kids. And when we get together as a family, it's because we want to. And it's a bit like an apostolic network where it's based on relationship rather than control. And we have different things to add around the table. We've got different ages, different experiences, different things that we're reading, etc. Different things that we argue about and all of that kind of thing. But wouldn't it be cool if our churches could be like this as well, where we're prepared to actually send out, not to lose. I didn't lose any of my kids when I sent them out, but I gained extended families. And perhaps we can too, if we're prepared to really bring up our spiritual children and send them out like this. Now, I want to, just in finishing, I want to change tack for a moment. I should have really finished there, but I've felt that this is something that I wanted to tack on, if you like, to my message. And so I'm going to do it. Again, Peyton Jones's book that I've mentioned earlier, Discipology, he uses slightly different terms. But he said that if we were to make disciples today, effectively today, there are 3 components that need to be in place. What I call relationships, he calls time. It's just that he's got alliteration with his going. What I call information, he calls teaching. What I call implementation, he calls tactics. So he's got the 3 T's. So it's obviously better. And he'll say that Weekend Church does information really well with its teaching, but information doesn't lead to transformation, because for transformation to actually happen, we need relationship that's in place. Now, there was a survey in America, a secular survey, I'll quickly show you. It says that when someone decides to do something, they'll only carry forward and do it 10% of the time. So who here's a preacher? Put up your hand if you're a preacher. Fantastic. So you might preach the best sermon ever, and you see all of these people respond. No wonder you get disappointed when you find that 90% of the people who actually haven't implemented it, except for Wayne, of course. He's incredible. If, however, as well as getting people to decide what to do, we get them, they also decide roughly when by, it goes up to a 40% success rate. If they then also decide roughly how they're going to do it, it goes up to a 50% success rate. But if there's some form of relational accountability, it goes up to a 95% success rate. That's the benefit of having relationships in place, the relational side in place. Without teaching, you'll lack depth. Better get a good social group who don't know what they believe. Without implementation, though, it will lack impact and stay in the bank of knowledge that is built up. Could I go back 1 slide, please? So in Australia, we major on time and teaching. That is on relationships and information. With a result that we disciple believers rather than make disciples. The missing link is actually the activation part. It's the implementation part, where we actually have to see, well, I guess you could say disciples, men and women, not just hear about the harvest, not just learn about the harvest, understand about the harvest, but actually go into the harvest. Sounds scary, doesn't it? Sounds scary. We must choose to love the mission rather than the methods that we currently use, and make the changes necessary to pursue the mission in ways that are effective today. Just in finishing, Jesus never actually told us to build a church. He said that was his job. But what he said was our job was actually to obey him, to obey his commands, to obey his teaching, by loving people like he did and making disciples. The Gospels of 3 years of his disciple making before people were activated into the book of Acts. And as we obey Jesus' commands, as he tells us to, as he instructs us to. He will build his church. Wayne, back to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Really appreciate both sessions that you've done for us today. Are there any questions on what Tim has said, maybe even flowing from last session as well, but in this session? Are there any questions? It's afternoon, after lunch. Do try and stay awake. Any questions?
I do have a question, probably more from this morning's lecture or presentation. I guess with like all the statistics of the church that we're seeing, I don't really see any links being made with the Laodicean church and like the time that we're living in. What do you have to say? Like, do you think there is a correlation between that and the times that we're living in?
Are you saying about people being neither hot nor cold? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, great question. I don't know. Does that answer you well? Look, again, we were talking over lunch. Some of us are talking over lunch about the fact that as Christians, we're here to be known for our love and also to show a different way. And I believe that there's starting to be a shift that's coming where people actually are coming seeking. Again, over lunch with the people I was with, I told the story of a young lady who's just turned 36 and she got baptised a month ago. She was brought up in an atheist family, no church background. And then I think it was about 6 years ago, and she lived in another state at the time. She died. And then she came back, was brought back to life in the hospital. She saw the white tunnel. And then she started asking spiritual questions and seeking. And she's an incredibly bright young lady. Just amazing how much she's learned already. But she's come to faith over this last year, got baptised in the discipleship group that I'm leading, etc. There was another couple about the same age, no church background. They were in Europe, and I think it was going through some of the cathedrals. They were really stirred and started thinking we should find out about this Christianity. And they started coming along to church, and they've come to faith as well. So I think that there are people out there who are open in a way that I haven't seen it before. But when you're talking about the neither hot nor cold, are you talking about Christians or non-Christians?
Say church. So we're in a very lukewarm place at the moment. I think you see that in the numbers of the economy. And yeah, the invitation of Jesus is like open the door of your heart.
Sorry. Are you all hearing her? Because what she's saying is actually good.
Can you repeat that, please? Yeah.
I don't know if I remember what I just said. I'm talking about like the state of the church and not the world, and us being stuck in a lukewarm state. And then the invitation from Jesus is like he's knocking at our heart and we have to let him in. And I guess I like that you are linking it back to Jesus and going back to him, you know, to get the church to come back to life. But yeah, that's kind of been in my head recently
I think that I see some churches where I think a larger percentage of the congregation are really spiritually alive. You'll probably hate me saying this, but NCLS research will say that the figures are higher in the Pentecostal churches and the non-Pentecostal churches. But it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, Adventist churches or anyone, any churches can actually, there's the opportunity for us all to grow in these areas and to become more passionate. But then within individual churches, you'll find that there's a bunch of people who are on fire and probably a bunch of people that aren't. So I'd say seek them out, and then, you know, work out, start hanging around with the people who are really on fire. They say that you become like the five people that you're actually closest to. And so if you can have a small fire that's burning with a small group of people and then start grafting more people into that, I won't even suggest what structures you might have for that because it could vary so much. I think there is the opportunity to light fires that will never be put out.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Chair.
thank you, Wayne. Thanks, everyone.